Hi, everybody. I am Misty Massey. I am the writing track director for Con Carolinas, and I'm here to moderate this thrilling panel called A is for Action. It's all about writing action scenes, love scenes, fight scenes. They're all action.
Hi, my name is Dan Jolly. I write stuff. I don't know how brief you want these brief introductions to get.
That's good.
Yeah, okay. We're good then. I write stuff.
Okay.
Hey everyone, I'm Larry Martin, also an author and co-author with Gail Z. Martin, and we write in a number of different genres. All, of course, have action.
Hi, I'm Ed McEwen. I'm a science fiction writer primarily known for the Mara series, also a black belt. So I hope to provide some useful tips and so forth.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stuart Jaffe. I know this is a shocker, but I'm a writer too. I write a lot of mostly fantasy, some science fiction. All of it has action, and I also am a black belt.
Hi, I'm Tamsin Silver, and I'm an astronaut, so I'm in the wrong place.
Too late, you're saying.
Shoot. All right, so I guess I'll be a writer. I'm a writer. I write urban fantasy and historical fantasy. And since in fantasy, the world is always coming to an end and someone has to save it, I write action.
Okay, so I'm just going to jump right in with the questions that we have prepared. And the first one is, whether it's a love scene or a fight scene, action scenes require intensity. How do you ramp up the intensity without tiring your readers?
Well, I'll start then because
Okay.
I got the mouth.
I didn't say it.
And I think the question actually has part of the answer, or one of the answers in it, which is I often, when I'm on panels like this, I say to write your write your fight scenes like love scenes. In that when you're writing romance or a love scene, it's not about physical. It's not so much about the physical part. It's not so much about this hand touched this part or this, A touched B and that kind of thing. It's about a conflict, an emotional issue, and there has to be a conflict there, and they are overcoming that conflict so that they can be together. And an ideal scene will have all that happen, and it's true of a fight scene too. You can write a chase or a punch or a whatever, but if there's an actual character-driven reason for that fight with conflict, and that will create that intensity. Because it becomes much more than just the physical fight.
I would agree with that. The emotional stakes are what get everybody involved in these situations. As this is a significant transition for one of the main characters, whether it is a fight or whether it is love scene. Sometimes people think you have to bang somebody over the head with a chair for action, but action can be the emotional development of a character as much as anything else.
I think it's the stakes. For me, I make sure that if there's fighting, there's a really high stake. Like, we're not going to fight to fight unless it's building character or unless we're doing something that is pushing the plot forward, that is taking us from point A to point B. And it's kind of like, my background's in theater. And so one of the things I always thought was neat was West Side Story. So West Side Story, for anyone who knows, is a musical, and has a lot of dance fighting, which sounds strange, but that's the choreography. It's about gangs in New York. Thank you. The person that no one here can see is doing this, and it's definitely one of the things people know from it. And I'm excited for the movie coming out for it.
I was going to say, they're remaking that, aren't they?
Oh, that. And it's got some great cast members, and I'm super pumped. And so, but the dancing in that, the fight dancing, it moves the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think because of that kind of background, and I've done fight scenes on stage, I had to take a class on fighting. And we had to put dialogue to it, and you had to figure out where those motions needed to go with which words to find out what moved your dialogue, what punched what words, why was it important. And so for me, one of the ways I try to help out is that I give language to it. I think Buffy's a big thing for me for that too.
Mm-hmm.
I like comedy. I like my comedy to sometimes be in there. if the fight is not dire and like, oh my God, we're all going to die and the whole world's going to burn, there's sometimes, for me, if there's fighting, there's comedy or there's love or there's something like that. So for me, it's the stakes and it's about moving the plot.
You know, for those of you without the theater background, because the second you brought up West Side Story, I also have a theater background, so I was right there with you. But it occurred to me that actually comic books do very similar thing because, you know, on stage you do have an actor there. You can physically have an altercation, but there's limits to how intense or exciting it can be because it's not like a camera that can swoop on in or follow you at 100 miles an hour on a motorcycle. So in a comic book, it's even more that way that you can't do anything because it's a still frame, which is why there's all that dialogue with that. You know, they show Spider-Man punching and he says all this stuff. Yeah. Because it's moving everything along and it's very similar. It occurred to me as you were speaking, I'm like, that's the exact same thing that they do. So there are other places you can look to get, to figure out how to do this if you're having trouble.
Oh, and the other thought I had was we haven't really talked about tiring your audience, which I can't imagine doing because of action. However, I can imagine doing it because it's not relevant, sort of taking off from what's already been said and saying, does it actually move the story forward and does the reader care? It's not action that tires the reader. It's relevance. And are we giving them too much information that really doesn't matter to propelling the story?
I also suspect that you have to ration your characters' heroics, if you will, because ordinary people from, you know, a fight or a traumatic event take days and weeks to recover from. And sometimes your characters run the risk of being reduced to caricatures. If they're, you know, in a fight and bound to the chair as they were, they bounce around the room and beat up the bad guys, and then they're ready to go fight somebody else 20 minutes later. With, you know, the rest of us are trying to figure out what body parts we still have at work.
And just from a more nuts and bolts perspective on the language itself, I do my best to have a kind of recognizable rhythm with fight scenes. Like if you have 16 or 17 really short sentences in a row, or if you have 2 or 3 really, really, really long paragraphs in a row, that doesn't work in my experience. But if like you've got a pretty fluid buildup, maybe with what would technically be run-on sentences here and there, culminating in then one really, really punchy sentence, it sort of guides the reader through the rhythm of the fight the way you want it to. Using onomatopoetic words, sometimes the bone snapped with a short, sharp crack, as opposed to long Latinate fancy words, works better in my experience.
Not that this has anything to do with action, but I remember when I was in junior high, there was a television show we had to watch in English class, and there were different characters, and one of them was Mrs. Onomatopoeia. And she would show up on the screen and go, bang, or clam, or, you know, and then she'd leave. And we loved Mrs. Onomatopoeia. But anyway.
Those are actually really, really useful in an action sequence. Again, something you have to remember if you're a beginning writer especially, is that you're writing prose, you're not filming. And because we all get little movies in our heads and we've been raised on TV and movies, but the way they show action is geared to the fact that they have a camera and that they can actually just show it. And if you try and do the similar thing in prose writing, it will fail.
Yeah.
Every time. Because you can't write a sentence that's, no matter how short, even if you make it one word, it's going to be slower than Jackie Chan can throw off a roundhouse kick. It's just, and it's never going to have that kind of excitement. That's part of why we, you know, in a movie, they can get away with action for action's sake sometimes that really has no, you know, has no character or plot point, and it's just really cool eye candy. But we can't. And so rhythm, as Dan was saying, the rhythms that you use are one of many techniques you have, you know, in your arsenal to make it exciting. And onomatopoeias, you know, to sit there and say he threw off 3 shots, bang, bang, bang. That's very those things make people see, feel, and hear what's going on.
Little sensory anchors help with that sort of thing, which are like if you've ever fired a pistol, you're familiar with the taste that is in your mouth and the smell in your nose of brass and the propellant. The smell of the lubrication of the pistol. If you're a martial artist, you know what it feels like to get a kick in the midsection. You're familiar with the smell of blood in your own nose if you fail to block something. So those little anchors of physicality are very useful for the reader for several reasons. One, they put them in the scene in a very vivid way, and they sort of have that underlying verity, which I think in writing transmits to the reader and says, okay, this is kind of how it really would be.
So something that Tamsin said brought me to this one. And I know that I have done this before because sometimes when I'm writing, particularly in a fight scene, particularly when there are more than two combatants involved, I like to use stage blocking with whoever is available, generally my family. Because they're here. But I love to use stage blocking to make sure that I'm not going to end up with too many fists and too many legs and too many left arms and that sort of thing. Have you ever used stage blocking when you've been planning out your action scenes?
Yeah,
Yeah?
totally. I've actually used figures, like little things or rocks. I have one time I took pieces of paper and I put the initials for each person and I set it out. Oh, if they move here and they go here, because my background's also in directing, and we used to do a prompt book, and you have the stage and the set drawn, and then you have a shape and a color for each person, and you draw the way they move. Interestingly enough, the one I did for my final project is still at Western Michigan as an example of how to do this. I got really retentive. My manic kicked in and I did everything. Everything was color coded and shape coded because I'm crazy. And so I'll sometimes do that if I'm having trouble seeing everyone in the scene. I don't have a family here. It's the dog, and he doesn't follow rules as much as I'd like him to. I can't even keep him from not showing up on camera when I do stuff. Like my roommate's not even here during this pandemic. She's off at her boyfriend's place, so I'm alone. And I'm working on some fight scenes right now, and so it gets hard to see. And so I'll draw it, or I will have little figures. I really need to want to get, anybody have those little green army guys? I
Amazon
want
delivers.
those. Okay, yes, I want to do that. I want to get some of those for some of my scenes as I start doing more of these bigger scenes, because I think it'd be helpful.
What's really cool is that Michael's, the craft store, now has these sorts of figures. Like this is a pirate set, and you can get all kinds of different, you can get cowboys and you can get army men and all that. So check the Michael's site.
Or you can break out your Dungeons and Dragons miniatures and maps, which also works.
I was totally thinking that too.
Well, my best example is when we were writing our steampunk story, we actually arranged a docent tour of Homewood Cemetery in Pittsburgh. And yes, we did, I think, scare the docent, but we used our family members in the cemetery in a live staging of putting people in certain places and figuring out how to arrange the shots and shoot it.
That's awesome.
One of the advantages of teaching martial arts is that I have a class, and when I was teaching at CPCC, I had a large fight scene in was once a
Oh,
hero.
now I'm jealous.
And I just got 4 black belts to stand in the center, and we had 30 people attack us.
Nice.
The dynamics of how that worked out played out very much in the story, because you could actually see them getting in each other's way, the fact that the more aggressive would surge forward and less aggressive would sort of hide behind them. It was very useful. And to this day, when I do an action scene, a lot of times I will just simply do it with one of the other instructors or a group of people. So creative mayhem.
A lot of it for me depends on how complicated this. If it's just 2 people fighting, I'm not gonna. I know from experience that most of the fight is actually not going to end up being described, because again, if you take the time to describe each punch and movement, it slows the whole thing down. Mm-hmm. And I can remember I wrote a short story a long, long time ago that was a swashbuckler kind of thing, and the 2 pirates were having a sword fight, and it's just the 2 of them, So it was really sentences like, after a lot of, this is a clumsy way to do it with a second, but, just a lot of slash and parry, blah, 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 blah. Because there was no way I was going to ever get that fast with. But when you get into large groups, for example, in the end of Southern Curses, which is the 6th book in my Max Porter series, there are literally, I think it's 12 people. It's like the culmination fight of everything from 6 books. So everybody's there, and later a ghost shows up, so there's even more people there. And there's a huge. It's at the Devil Tramping Ground, and there's this huge circle of people, and I had to know, but I also had to convey where everybody is, because if your reader has no idea who's where in relation to everybody else, then they don't understand where the threat is coming from.
I don't normally do like actual stage blocking, but one of the things that I did for a while was writing comic books set in World of Warcraft. Ooh. And then it's not exactly stage blocking, but I went into the game, I had an account, I went into the game and wherever the story was set, like made really, really careful notes of where everything was. And that wasn't necessarily so much that I needed to know it for the action to work, but because I knew that I was going to get roasted by the players if I got a detail wrong.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Well, I did that for a fight scene in New York. There's the book's not out yet. It's Moon Over Manhattan. It'll come out in the next year with Falstaff. But it opens with a fight scene, swords and guns, in Central Park at a certain area near the playground. No children are present. And so I went over there with a camera and I walked it from where I was and took photos in sections. I'd step, take a picture, go across. And in my head, I knew the fight well enough that I was like, all right, they jump, they go here, that's where they could go over. And then after I'd worked it, I would take it with me and I would go back there because New Yorkers will check that shit.
Mm-hmm. They will.
And Google Maps can be
I do that a lot.
If you can't be there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Google Maps can be your friend if you can't be there in person.
One of the pieces I did for Faith Hunter, I was looking at a topographical, I was using Google Maps, and I was like, it looks like it's an amphitheater. I mean, it's something way in another country I'm never getting to. It's it's way out in the eastern area. And I was guessing. I was like, well, I think that's an amphitheater. What's funny is that someone introduced me not just to Google Maps, but what is it? It's the world one. You can actually drop it in and it's
Google
all
Earth.
Google Earth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Google Earth. And I was like, I'd already written all the scenes in that section. But I was like, oh, and I just happened to drop my person in the middle. Usually when you drop it in the middle of the park, you can't get, people don't do the whole inside. They had. And all of a sudden, I'm actually, and it's live. It's a camera feed, a video they've done. And I'm looking and I'm like, it's an amphitheater. So it's really helpful. I was so excited. I wrote Faith. I was like, I was right.
The internet has, like you said, it's made that so made being in a place you can't be so much better. Yeah. Obviously, you can't get the smells and tastes, but I've done stories in England and one in North Africa where I literally just went down to the street view, so I knew exactly the lay of the land. And the one in England, it was in northern England, and I had my characters. They were going to go down this one alley, and so I'm going down the alley to see what's there, and there's a pub there, and so with Google, it's Google Maps, so the pub's name is highlighted. So I click on it, and the next thing I know, I'm at the pub's website where I can see inside the pub.
Yep.
To the full, and I'm like, well, make my job easy.
If you want to take that even one step further, possibly unnecessarily further, but I did it anyway. Oculus Quest, the VR setup, has an app called Wander, which is partnered with Google Earth. You can do the same thing, and you're there in 3 dimensions, look all around you.
I think that's a writer's tool we all need.
I'm like, what was that
called again?
It's an Oculus Quest, which is the most affordable of the Oculus game systems, and it's called Wander.
Hopefully we can still all write that off. And
I'm going to give it a shot.
Part of research.
Kenzie brings up a good point that the audience for this sort of book can be particularly unforgiving of mistakes in regard to firearms or usage of weapons. Things like people said he took the safety off on his revolver when very few, if any, revolvers ever have safeties. Making a long shot with a 1911 45, which is you're better off throwing it at somebody if they're more than 50 feet away. Details of that sort you can really get you burned on.
I figured that point was going to come up, so I looked through my bookshelf to bring out this, because this is what I use. Not mine, but it's the Writer's Guide to Weapons.
Interesting.
And it's a really good primer for knives and guns from all different eras. So like the section on machine guns and automatics goes all the way back to like Tommy guns and things like that.
I have that book.
And it goes into all.
I'm going to get that book.
So if you've never shot a gun, or if you have no knowledge of guns, but you are determined to actually put in some specifics, I recommend that book, but there's others out there as well.
And that's so much easier than my method, which was to have a father who was the first sergeant of an infantry company who allowed a 12-year-old to play with things that really he should not have. But I had.
Well, I still recommend, though, if you're gonna be writing firearms in a detailed way, because you can do action and just say he picked up a gun, he picked up a handgun, he picked up a rifle, and as long as you don't go into specifics, it'll work fine. But if you're writing in either a genre like military science fiction where you're kind of required to be more specific, or if you just want to be, then I recommend you really just go to a shooting range, learn to shoot. You don't have to become an expert. I've done it like twice with some friends who are Marines, and they basically guided me through it. But when you shoot and you feel the kick of a handgun, you'll be like, oh. And it's not that far from you and you missed. You'd be like, oh, it's not so easy to shoot from, and then I'm standing. So it's like suddenly, oh, if I'm driving with one hand going 50, 60 miles an hour and I'm shooting back, I mean, no, it's not that easy.
Oh, you can identify with the stormtroopers.
I did that for Billy, actually. I had a friend who got me, this is before I even lived out in New Mexico, and he got me a revolver that would have been similar to the one Billy would have shot from, and it was old. And he showed me, that's what I learned to shoot on. He taught me how to shoot with those, and had me change out. And at that point I was like, because he had to, use the pin to get out the kit. I was like, no one is refilling while they're riding a horse. Right. I'm sorry.
Right.
And so
that's what you get. It's those little details. Because even I was shooting just a Marine issue 1911, and when it was time to refill, put all the bullets in, I discovered, you actually have to push down hard. That does not just that does
not just drop in. No.
Yep.
So yeah, if you read the Billy books and he fires 6 shots, he grabs another gun. Like I make sure that if I actually write it where he's like, after he just tosses it or he grabs the rifle, or I make him change, because the minute I used that gun and realized that, I was like, yeah, no, that's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. That was the approach that I took for hand-to-hand stuff. The just go down to the shooting range approach. I signed up for martial arts classes and
nice.
wound up taking classes in like 5 different disciplines. I sucked in all of them. What?
Well, so might your character. It's not necessarily the case in these action things that they're all, commandos or SEAL guys. Some of them are just.
But the advantage was that I got to hang out with guys like you, and observe the techniques and listen to the techniques explained and find out what it feels like to be submitted in various different holds and whatnot.
You also find out when you actually fight in martial arts, or I guess boxing or any kind of fighting, the rhythms of fighting are very different than, again, what somebody who has no experience only has seen TV and movies where it's choreographed. And when it's not choreographed, when you're actually fighting, the rhythms are very different. They can be, especially my experience has been that the more experienced the fighters, the less fighting actually happens, because everyone's is trying to get the other to commit, and they're so that they can react and things like that. But also, I can't tell you how many times I've slammed shins with somebody because we both kick at the same time. You know, it's not pretty and it hurts.
That actually brings us, we've kind of wandered into my next question somewhat. So even though we've covered it a bit, I'm going to go ahead and ask, because I think there are some details we can still work on. And that was, is there a difference in writing fight scenes that involve weapons versus hand-to-hand? And how much do you think the writer should know about fight styles to make a fight scene feel true?
Depends how specific they're going to get. Like, you know, like Stuart said, like if you're going to get really specific, then yeah, you should probably study it a little bit. If you're gonna give the basic idea, then I think that getting some knowledge, you don't have to go as far. Sometimes I go down the rabbit hole and I try to really see, like I found videos of certain kicks and I really wanted to see how you landed and which way you were facing, and some of it really mattered. And then sometimes it doesn't really matter. So I think it really depends on what you're writing and the character you're writing for.
That's that's exactly what I was going to say. It's the character.
The character you're writing for.
Because I have two, I have many series, but two in particular for this. One, the Max Porter series. Max is just a guy who ended up in this situation where he's now running a detective agency with a ghost. So when he starts off, he knows nothing about any of it. So for him, if somebody pulls a gun on him, it's a gun. That's all he knows. But my Nathan K series, Nathan is proficient. He knows what he's doing. And so that's why I ended up getting that book, and I started learning these things, because I'm like, I can't pull off Nathan. I can't lie. You know, Nathan's can't be wrong about these things. And he's going to look, and he knows the difference between a revolver and a 1911, or he'll know the difference between an AK-47 and you know, an M1 or whatever. It's important to have that knowledge, and then it doesn't hurt you, the author, to know these things or experience these things, because it gives you more opportunities as a writer, more ideas to come up with. If you don't know what it's like, we were just talking about hand to hand. If you don't know what it's like, how sloppy actual fighting is compared to a movie, then you'll never be able to put that into your book. But if you know it, that's something unique that you can bring that experience to life, and that'll be exciting for your reader.
It's research. Whether or not you're going to include it in the story, you sometimes need the knowledge to know how the person would act, even if you don't have to give the details. Mm-hmm. And so that comes, like the others have already said, it's partially genre and partially knowing your audience and what they're going to expect from your story. If you're writing a romance, you might not need to tell them all the specifics of the weapons. But if you're writing a police procedural, you better get it right.
And you don't have to be Conan the Barbarian to write about Conan the Barbarian. But having held a sword and having gone around with it and realizing that the sword that seemed light when you started now is getting heavier and heavier. You know, how much, as Stuart said, fatigue plays a huge part in these things, and how much sloppier it is in real life, even between martial artists. I've seen two black belts exchange blows at the same time and knock each other down. One of the things we say is that an untrained person can keep track of 4 things that are going on at one time. The trained person can keep track of 10. And you just hope that they're the 10 correct ones. And likewise, I've seen untrained people simply stare at a punch coming in and be hit in the face because it was not one of the 4 that they had brain power to process. They were on something else.
I was the one that got punched in the face.
I'm so sorry about that. But it's a big club, and most of us have been members at one time or another.
I would love to take a martial arts course, but I really cannot be allowed to like be flipped and land on my back because I'm really injured. But I really would love to take a class, but I'd be like, there are things I just can't do.
There are, and Stuart and I were talking about it a little earlier, internal arts, which include yoga and Tai Chi Chuan and Bagua, that don't actually involve contact, but allow one to work the body in a martial fashion. These things have martial application, which I found out when I was asked to throw a haymaker at a Chinese Tai Chi master. And I'm used to seeing the little old men in the park moving nice and slow. but it, when sped up, is effective for combat because I ended up 10 feet away facing another direction, unsure of what had happened. Yeah, I gave him the gift of my energy and he used it.
That was nice of you. Wow. You know, we talk a lot about tropes in fiction that drive us crazy, but this time I'd like you to tell me, are there action tropes that you just absolutely love?
I love things blowing up, which I shared with my co-author and wife. So I think it was in Iron and Blood, we actually made sure we added an explosion in each chapter. Now, it was related to the story, which is critical, but just to keep it going, and that was the nature of it was an action book. So yes, I like things to blow up.
I like cleverness. I like to do things with, there's one of them in in Hope of the Dam, the second book in the Sky series, where they're in an empty apartment. And she's hidden, if you've ever been to New York and you know some of those loft apartments have these huge beams.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's hidden her swords above on them. And so the reader doesn't, well, now they are. She leaps, they're talking and they're just being silly, and she jumps up to hang on there. And all of a sudden, when she comes down, she has them. And so I sort of like to play with that sometimes. As I said, I have a big Buffy thing. I love smart dialogue and fun stuff when I'm fighting. It's one of the tropes I love.
Mm-hmm.
I love it when something jams. Because it happens so often in real life.
I always like creativity within the violence. I mean, I can think of a lot.
Frighten me.
What?
You're
Well, I can think of a lot of
me.
film things like John Wick or anything by or any Jackie Chan, where if it's just violence and it's just action, I can think of on the opposite end, The Walking Dead. Mm-hmm. You could tell that they even realized shooting another zombie is not going to be that exciting, so they just kind of we hit a bunch of zombies. That gets boring. And watching somebody just punch or run or do things that we've seen a million times is boring. And so when they're creative with the weaponry, with what's around them, that's a way to bring in that excitement. It also, as we started this whole thing off, it's about character. So if your character is smart enough to grab that lamp or use Jason Bourne using a book. So that was a classic one that everyone that blew everyone's mind because most people had never thought you could use a book that way. Mm-hmm. Anything like that is always far more interesting and says more about characters and situations than just having another fight.
Jackie Chan using a stool
or a ladder,
mm-hmm.
or the ladder.
A refrigerator.
A refrigerator.
I missed that movie.
I don't think I saw that one.
Oh, that's from Rumble in the Bronx. He's
oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah, some guy comes up and he hits him with the top part of the fridge, and then as that part comes down, he hits him with the bottom part of the fridge, and then it's a whole grocery store thing. It's awesome.
Which actually,
grocery store thing.
As somebody who lived in the Bronx, I have to tell you, it was Rumble in Vancouver. There are no mountains around the Bronx.
No, there's not. I lived up there. I know. Yeah, I know.
Good Italian food, though.
Oh, see, now you're making me hungry. Is there an author whose action scenes just always set your pulse pounding, or any one book in particular?
Faith Hunter writes some amazing fight stuff, man. I love, if I get stuck, I'll pick up one of Jane Yellowrock books and I'll read one of her fight scenes with Jane, and that really helps me out. But that's literally that just came to mind off the bat.
For me, C.J. Cherry, one of the ones I enjoyed very much was a Paladin, because I felt that she was taking a woman sword fighter and making her extremely realistic in her training, because you sometimes get these women sword fighters that are fighting guys that are 50, 80 pounds. heavier and, a foot and a half taller. And this guy said, do not go toe to toe with a, 18-hour a month guardsman. You have to fight smarter. You don't have the leisure to throw a sloppy cut. Everything you do has to be perfect, which is often true for female martial artists that I work with or teach, and I've had a couple for instructors. They have to be very precise because they don't weigh 210 at 6 foot. Roseanne Di Tommaso, 5'4" of death. Amy Becton, kind of the same way. If they hit you in a spot where it would slow up anybody, regardless of their mass and their power.
It's a different kind of action, but and this may be an easy target. But Jim Butcher, the magical fight scenes that he's got in the Dresden Files. One that comes to mind is I forget which book it was in, but Harry has his shield up, which protects against like concussive force, but doesn't do much for heat. And he has to maintain it even though the flesh of his hand is getting burned off. And I was riveted, on the edge of the figurative seat.
Nice.
In a similar vein, I really like Orlando Sanchez and his series, which is the Montague and Strong, which is somewhat of an urban detective fantasy series. So there's supernatural and magical elements, sort of similar to the Butcher series. But you get into it and you don't notice you're in an action series. You're just trying to figure out what happens and get through it. So it gets you engaged and you're just reading. You're not thinking about what it is. It's just enjoyable.
I'd also add some non-genre authors, which I find very helpful when I'm trying to improve my fight scene writing, because they're not encumbered by trying to worry about a dragon or or a ray gun. They're just dealing with the actual action of the moment. And so for me, old pulp from like the 70s and 80s, like the Destroyer series, which is Remo Williams. That was a movie made off of that by Warren Murphy, or The Executioner, which is the Mac Bolan series by Don Pendleton. That's all those books are, is they're short. It's nothing but action. So those are good. If I'm looking for more intense kind of action where it might not be as fast paced, but it's more building up like that, I'll go to like horror novels like Jack Ketchum, who's one of the most terrifying writers I ever read. You want to learn how to make a short sentence carry a massive punch. Read anything he's written. Brian Greene's also a really good horror writer who does a lot like that. And then Westerns are really great for it too, I find, or historical fiction like John Jakes or Louis L'Amour, of course, great Western writer. And so there's always people out there outside of genre who are doing great stuff.
Robert Parker wrote Spencer, Jesse Stone.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did you guys ever read the Doc Savage books?
Oh yeah.
Oh, I was such a fan back when I was a kid. I had like a whole bookshelf, and like Stuart said, they're really tiny. So a whole bookshelf was like 100 books. Those were my thing back then. But
they were great.
What are some of the mistakes that you see new writers make when they're trying to write action?
Too long. You want it to move, you want it to fly. They'll like write really long, wrong descriptive sentences, and I'm like, and I've made this error for a while. And you have to break it up just a little, and like they don't have to be super short, but like helping it feel like it moves faster, or giving too much detail about clothing unless it's important to the fight, or or going into making it last so long that the person who's reading it goes, okay, when is this fight over? If there's nothing behind it, I find that, like what we talked about, our very first question, that is the mistake. If all the stuff that we all brought up, if those things aren't into the fight scene, a lot of times people will skip it.
I think Stuart brought up earlier the whole concept of people have movies in their mind when they're writing, which tends to give you a narrative which is overly descriptive and somewhat boring. And we talked about, you really need to do it from the character, and that's where they miss it. They're not giving you the character's feelings and what they're experiencing. they're describing the scene like you would see in a movie to give you the world.
I think something else you see a lot of beginning writers do is because we teach writers not to info dump and not to have long, things like that. They get themselves in fight scenes and they haven't properly set up the location. They haven't set up the situation. So then what happens is while they're trying to fight, they're also trying to describe the room. And instead, this is one of those cases where if I know if my character walks into a diner and I know by the end of that scene, that diner is going to be in tatters and if it's even standing, I'm going to take an extra paragraph in the beginning and make it very clear where everything is. So then when I'm in the fight, I can just say he jumped over the counter and I don't have to say what side of the room the counter's on and things like that.
Yeah. Yes.
One of the things that was mentioned, I think, Stuart, you said it earlier about comic book setup where you've got a fight scene going on and then you've got Spider-Man saying these giant word balloons next to his head, which I don't like because by the time Spider-Man got through saying all that stuff, the bad guy would have left. And translating, like, I know a lot of people grow up reading comic books and then take that sensibility into writing prose, and too much dialogue in a fight scene is a big problem. I knew it was a problem before I started taking martial arts classes, but then after my first sparring session, it was all I could do to breathe. Much less.
Yeah, dancing and singing is the same way, man. You're just like, you want me to do what while I sing this?
Yeah. So, I'm wondering if my heart's going to explode. I thought I was going to die that first time. Anyway, yeah. Having these long conversations and expounding upon, ideological differences and whatnot is grossly unrealistic and doesn't work.
And I think that's particularly true when one considers that most of the combatants aren't, training for this all the time. And as you say, if you're in a fight, we have a saying in martial arts that fights take only a few seconds, beatings take a long time. But the fight, particularly one-on-one, is usually determined fairly quickly, by which I mean first 30 seconds to a minute, one side or the other usually dominates. Michael Straczynski took in issue with that, the fellow that made Babylon 5. He said he was in a fight in England where a couple of guys jumped him. Well, that was kind of the point, which is, the fight part of that, who was going to win or who was going to lose, was over almost immediately. The getting your butt kicked went on, unfortunately, for a very long time. And fights in fiction often just don't come with the set of consequences, physical, emotional, moral, that they do in reality. And that's, I think, one of the pitfalls for a beginning writer.
Real quickly, I want you to tell if there's a way for fans to check you out, where your website is, how they can find you on social media. And Stuart, would you go first?
Sure, you can find me at stuartjaffe.com. I went really creative on that one. And I'm on a lot of social media, but mostly Facebook, which is Stuart Jaffe Author. Those are the two easiest places to reach me. And from my website, you can click on to sign up for the newsletter. You'll get some free books and stuff. And that's a really great way to communicate with me, because then it's much more focused. You get email that you can get to me. And
Equally creative, danjolly.com. And that's with E before the Y in Jolly. And there's links to all my stuff.
You can find pretty much everything for me at tamsinsilver.com. I do tend to use Facebook more, but I am also on Twitter. I just have one of those pesky little day jobs. So I really don't have time. I only have so many spoons. And so I have a tendency to mostly be on Facebook.
You can find me at larrynmartin.com, and on Facebook you can find us. We share, Gail and I, for the Shadow Alliance is our shared group for all of our publications.
On Facebook and mostly on Amazon, where you can find all of my work, and with Copper Dog Publishing, which is a small publishing house that does most of my stuff.
Okay. And I am MistyMassey.com, Misty Massey on Facebook, Misty Massey on Twitter. So come find me. Guys, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I really appreciate all of you being able to come and do this for us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Good night.
Night.
At all. Bye. See you sometime in person, I hope.
I hope
Hopefully
so.
soon. Yes.
Yes.